future course of the program, and there were a lot of meetings with raised voices and folks afraid to to get into it. But I think that it had to have been very rare if it happened that after those meetings, both of us didn't walk away from them, and within an hour or two recognize that whatever had been said or whatever had happened was done with sincere convictions and with the best interest in getting a job done, but coming at it from different viewpoints.
Well, was his interest in auto catalysts because of platinum or some other reason?
Well, I'm sure that platinum had a lot to do with it, but I suspect that Val, like most of us that are in science, do have a social conviction that helps us make some decisions we make about projects and efforts, and that Val saw in the developments of the early 50s with respect to automotive pollution and its impact on the public health and quality of life of our population. He saw an opportunity to use some of the same technology that had been developed at high cost and with hard effort in the platinum reforming area to this challenge. At the time, there was a lot known about the oxidation efficiency of platinum, and it must have seemed like a very natural application. In fact, in the middle 50s, the automobile companies were responsive and occasionally would get excited and send out to refining catalyst companies asking, send us some catalyst. The concept developed, it's very obvious in the literature today, in Detroit, that a catalyst was a catalyst was a catalyst. And if a particular company, someone wanted to start a program to see if these catalysts really would work, someone would call up a friend from graduate school or an acquaintance who happened to work for an oil company or a catalyst manufacturer, and they would get 5 pounds of a desulfurization catalyst or a reforming catalyst, and they put it in a converter with some screens ahead of it and behind it, and whatever results they got would go into the common store of knowledge as reflecting this is what a catalyst does. And I'm sure that in seeing this type of thing happening, it was very easy for Val to say, boy, if we really tried to develop a catalyst for this application, as challenging as it is, we ought to be able to do a hell of a lot better than these catalysts that someone sends them off the shelf because they want a catalyst. And so I think that these were probably the opportunities that Val saw, the opportunity to use the technology that had been used to make money for the company, to make some more money for the company, but also to do some good that perhaps was more straightforward and more readily seen than the good that we do in generating higher octane gasoline.
How would you contrast Block and Hensel?
Val was an engineer. Val was a person who looked at an objective and figured out how to solve it or how to get there, and it was unfortunate if you got if you got in his path in doing that. Herman, in contrast, I would characterize more as a scientist, and with those two terms, it's important, you know, that I don't think of either of those terms negatively. I think of them, these two men being engineers and scientists respectively, in the very best sense. Herman was a scientist. Herman was attuned to the requirements the engineer would have on projects that he was working for. Herman was perhaps a good enough scientist that he could sometimes be a pretty good engineer on some of those projects, and some of his ideas for equipment or process. Herman, I believe, has a number of patents that were issued for converter designs, for example, that would make a liar out of me if I said he was a scientist in a strictly pure sense that didn't include that kind of license. But Herman was a scientist. Herman was and is a scientist, and Herman was perhaps more responsive to people as people. I'm sure that Herman found it necessary in the course of his career to tell some people that they really weren't needed anymore. It certainly seemed to me that that would have been much more difficult and much harder for Herman to do than Val, but that's the way it looked to me.
Who did you work with when you were at Kentucky, and what was this on?
When I went to Kentucky, I worked for Paul Sears and Lyle Dawson. Lyle Dawson was the head of the department, physical chemist, and he had taken over the department in about 1947 or 48, and was in the process of bringing it from a rather mediocre status among state universities in chemistry to what he felt at least would be one that would be respectable. I believe that the first PhDs in physical chemistry may have come, if not during his period, certainly there hadn't been any for some time before he came. But he had a program involving studies of solutions of non-aqueous solvents, properties of these dilute solutions, and these were attuned toward possible use in batteries, but they were pretty basic studies to continue to nail a little further one more term onto the Shedlovsky equation or the Onsager equation or Ostwald's law of infinite dilution or what have you. But so Dawson had started that program. Sears had come back from the military service and had been one of his early PhDs and had stayed on to take a major responsibility in running that program. And so I worked for Sears directly, but he was still not a member of the graduate faculty at that time, so Dawson was my advisor and director as far as the record, and many regards was concerned.
And how did you learn about UOP?
Well, I had worked a summer at Standard of Indiana in the middle of my graduate school, and they were putting up a process that summer, a UDEX process for the separation of benzene, toluene, xylenes, which they had licensed from Universal Oil Products. And so that's the first time I ever heard the name. But I certainly didn't look at them as a place to work because of what I heard from Standard of Indiana that summer. It was a lot later that I learned about the patent quarrels that had between UOP and Standard of Indiana that dated back to UOP's conception back in the teens. But I did come to have the understanding that wherever it was at all possible, Standard of Indiana would not use a process from Universal Oil Products, and they'd gotten around to having to do so that summer, and there was usually a curse word involved any time that someone said something about Universal Oil Products. And but a couple of years later, when I was getting out of school, Universal Oil Products came to interview at Kentucky, and I remembered the name, but I realized they didn't really want to talk to me because it indicated that they were interested in talking to inorganic and organic chemists. The day after they had been there, Lyle Dawson, the department head, called me in and said, how come you didn't interview with Universal Oil Products? He didn't say it that way because it wasn't in Lyle Dawson's manner to say how come, but that was the gist of it. And I said, well, they didn't explain it. He said, well, I think that must have been a misunderstanding. Herman Block was here yesterday from there, and I had lunch with him, and he said they were looking for physical chemists in particular, and asked if I would recommend someone, and I gave him your name, and you'll be hearing from them to invite you up. So that happened, and when I got there, I asked the personnel man, Maury Cox, about this misunderstanding I had had, and reminded him of what the posting had called for. And he said, well, I asked for either for inorganics and inorganic chemists. Doesn't that cover all chemists? So I guess maybe by some definitions he might have been right, but then Maury was an engineer by training.
Well, some people view UOP as a rather aggressive company. Do you see it that way?
Yes, I certainly would have considered UOP throughout my association with them as being aggressive, both during the period that it was only Universal Oil Products and UOP, and continuing through the period when it's been part of signal companies and currently of Allied Signal. With age, perhaps there might have been some mellowing from the period when I came there, but every time that I get to thinking that, something happens that shakes me up and suggests that maybe it's still pretty aggressive. So yeah, I'd buy that, Burt.
Well, if you think back to your days in the hills of West Virginia, where was that?
That was right on the border of Mingo, McDowell County, at an old coal mine community called Isaban. The nearest high school was 15 miles away in either McDowell County or which was Yeager, or Mingo County, which was Gilbert. And because we lived, because the coal camp was almost on the border, they jointly operated the elementary school during the period that I was there, and you had the choice of whether you went to Jaeger or Gilbert, and I chose Jaeger because you didn't have to actually cross any mountains to get there, and that meant that I wouldn't lose very many days of school each winter. If I'd chosen Gilbert, I'd had a pretty good shot at missing about 6 weeks of school each winter. So, but it was a coal mine and coal mine community in bloody Mingo, and it was an experience that I was back there. I was in that community this spring, about 3 months ago, for the first time in over 30 years. And I'm glad I worked hard to get out of there.
What do you recall about the period?
Well, it was a period that was difficult for me, and not. It was difficult for me in a way that was difficult for other kids, perhaps. When I started school, my parents were both teachers, and my dad was a principal of a little 4-room school there at Isaban. Within a couple of years, they starved out, and he had to leave teaching and go to work in the mines. But my mother continued and continued to teach throughout the time that I was there. But perhaps because of that, there were several things that made a big difference. My father did not want to work in the coal mines, and when he felt that he eventually was forced into it for economic reasons, all I can remember from the time that I could remember was that I was not going to work in a coal mine. And I think a lot of the pressure that I got as a child was really came out of that strong conviction on their part that I wasn't going to end up there. Because they both worked, it was probably convenient for them to have me start school a year earlier than I normally would have. And then when I was in the 5th grade, the prettiest girl in the camp was in the same grade with me, and I was determined to be her boyfriend, and looking for ways to win her. We ended up in a competition to see who could score better on our own test, and of course when we were both scoring 100s on those, they put a limit on it, but we shared a room with 6th grade, and so we started taking the 6th graders test, and the teacher happened to find one of those one day, and when she realized that we'd both done better than the 6th graders, convinced my mother, who was a principal, that we should both move over into the 6th grade. So the result was that when I got ready to go to high school the next year, junior high and high school in Jaeger, I was 2 years younger than my classmates, and that's something that I wouldn't wish on anyone. None of my children will have that opportunity, but it made for a high school period that I didn't cover myself with glory in high school. I was a B to C student. I was big mouth. I did a lot of compensating for being too young to be in the whatever group I was trying to run with, and It was probably it was my sophomore year of college, really, before I perhaps outgrew and outran that problem and began to hit my stride.
Well, how did you hear about Berea?
I was trying to find a place I could go to that the family could afford, and things weren't going too well there. Marshall sounded like a good possibility, but it certainly seemed like it was going to be expensive. Concord wasn't too attractive to me because seemed to be pretty much a teacher's college, and by that time I'd like to say I decided to go into chemistry or even science, but I hadn't. I was committed to becoming a journalist. I've been very strongly convinced or influenced by Ernie Pyle during the war, and the columnist whose columns appeared in the Williamson Daily News or the Welsh Daily News, and I thought the thing to do was to become a journalist, and so the teachers' colleges didn't sound that attractive to me. And somewhere someone remembered that there was a school in Kentucky called Berea that you had to work if you went there, but that there was no tuition and the room and board was pretty modest, and if you absolutely had to, if you had no money whatsoever, you could work and take 5 years to get out and go with absolutely nothing. And that sounded pretty good to me. I made application. I was put on a waiting list because it turned out that my family had too much money. And by this time I'd become pretty sold on going there, and I drilled them on long distance about what their reasoning was, and got their numbers and sat down with the financial numbers that I had turned in from my parents, and was able to convince them that that had been a bubble year because of the boom in the coal mines during that period, and convinced them to let me in.
Well, now, your parents, I understand, warned you about the neighbor daughter.
Yes, that when I was still in high school and perhaps even younger, I got this continual drilling about you're going to go to college, you're not going to work in the coal mines, and my father was convinced that if he let down his vigilance and I let down my guard, that I would follow the path of 99% of the folks from that area, and somewhere around the time that I was 14, I would get a girl pregnant, and of course marry her as being the honest thing to do, and then be supported by both families probably until I was 16, when I could quit school and go to work in the mines. And so to that end, you know, they made sure that I saw all the booklets that showed the horrors of venereal disease, and that I understood, you know, where it came from, and that it was best, you know, to retain my virginity until I got through college and got out of the coal mines. And but there was a little girl that lived next door that the most I think that girl ever wore was shorts and a halter, and she seemed to be, you know, the way that that the coal mines were determined to get me. And but I'd look at that little girl, and I'd I'd watch her, and then I'd go back in the house and I'd read those books. But when the folks left town, the last thing that I would get before they left, if they were going to be gone for the day, was about a 20-minute talk about what would happen to my future if I gave in to my urges. And I think I said at one time, you know, if I ever ended up marrying a girl from West Virginia, you know, I'd probably be impotent because I was terminally afflicted. As it happened, I did marry a young woman from West Virginia who I met in Berea, and I have 4 children, so I guess it wasn't all that bad, but.
Well, long before the emphasis on women in engineering and chemistry, UOP used to be well represented by women at some of these meetings. Was that intentional, or?
I never knew Burt. I'm trying to think. Let's see. We hired a young chemist, Dahlia Germanis. Is this might be one of the people you're thinking about? A woman. Hertha Scala worked with us, of course, many years, and just retired recently, and she and Val are married now, of course. But Hertha certainly, Hertha started with the company about 2 years before I did, and retired about 4 years ago, I guess. But yes, Hertha certainly went to a lot of meetings, and maybe there's something about working at UOP that makes you want to get away as often as you can. But don't remember any others. But it did seem for many years that UOP took a stronger affirmative action line with respect to females well before it was required and legislated. But it may be that just the ones that we had were more visible.